Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a creaky wooden bench to a candlelit table in a medieval castle. You can smell the roasted venison, hear the clatter of pewter goblets, and maybe, just maybe, sense the rising panic in your gut because, well, you have absolutely no idea what you're doing. Someone hands you a slab of coarse bread. Is it a plate? A napkin? A snack? Yes. Welcome to dinner etiquette in the Middle Ages, where rules are as rigid as the armor worn by your host, and somehow even more dangerous to ignore. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, comment with your location and what time it is where you're watching. Always fun to see who else is feasting at this strange, sleepy table with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at court a few hours before dusk. The halls smell like herbs and body heat, and everything is somehow both impressive and faintly damp. Someone says you've been invited to a banquet, and this sounds exciting, until you realize it's not just eating. It's performing. Every gesture, every bite, every pause will be judged, even if it's behind thin smiles and goblets brimming with wine. If you sneeze while holding the roast, you might never be invited back. The first awkward moment comes before you even sit down. There are no name cards, no place settings, just an unspoken code that you absolutely weren't briefed on. The table is long, heavily decorated, and daunting. You're drawn toward the middle, but pause. That's dangerous territory. In most medieval courts, the center seat belongs to the highest-ranking individual, often the king or lord, flanked by increasingly lesser nobles in descending order. Your seat? Way down there by the slightly chipped jug and the sullen scribe picking at something green. Historians still argue whether these seating arrangements were strictly enforced or just socially understood, but one thing's clear: if you took a spot above your station, you wouldn't be given a second chance. Best case scenario, you're publicly corrected and slink to your rightful place. Worst case? Well, remember that noble in Burgundy who was exiled for sitting too close to the duke's mistress? Exactly. The table itself is cluttered in a charming but also anxiety-inducing way. There's a trencher, a flat piece of stale bread in front of each guest, used as a plate and, eventually, a donation to the poor, or the dogs. You resist the urge to nibble it. Too soon. Someone will notice. The goblet to your right may not even be yours. Communal drinking was a thing. If you're lucky, it's just ale. If you're really lucky, the guy who used it before you doesn't have open sores on his lips. Now, knives. You were supposed to bring your own. The court may provide some cutlery for honored guests, but in many medieval courts, personal knives were an extension of one's identity, decorative, sharp, and probably covered in dried cheese. Using someone else's knife? Incredibly rude. Asking for one? Embarrassing. Not having one at all? Social death. And no, don't even think about asking for a fork. Forks were seen as excessive, effeminate, and suspicious. In fact, when they first appeared in Byzantium, some religious leaders declared them tools of the devil. In much of Western Europe, diners used their fingers, which meant table manners revolved heavily around hand-washing rituals, before and after the meal. You see a servant approach with a basin and towel, your cue to dip, dry, and silently pray your fingernails are presentable. You glance around for cues. Is that guy picking at a quail leg with 3 fingers and a pinky out? Probably a noble. That woman tearing into bread with both hands and no care in the world? Possibly royalty. You, trying to mimic both and failing at either? Most definitely the new guy. Your neighbor leans in and whispers, "Don't lean on the table." You flinch back. Apparently, elbows were frowned upon, not because they were impolite, though they were, but because they disrupted the carefully measured balance of the long boards laid atop trestles. One wrong shift, and the whole meal could tip into someone's lap. This actually happened once in the court of King John of England, an entire goose, a bowl of gravy, and a juggler's wig ruined in one tragic lean. The food finally arrives in grand procession. Roasted birds, pottage, pies with surprise contents, sometimes literally a live bird, yes, that was a thing, and trenchers already sagging from the weight. The aroma is divine. You want to dive in. But wait, another silent cue, no one touches a thing until the host does. You lock eyes with a young man reaching for a drumstick too soon. The steward clears his throat. The young man pulls back. The drumstick remains, sacred. It's at this moment you realize, this isn't dinner. It's theater. A very hungry, very formal, very unpredictable performance. One where you're expected to laugh at jokes you don't understand, compliment dishes you can't identify, and somehow keep your own appetite in check while watching others gleefully gnaw on swan wings. You take a breath. You smile politely. And as the man beside you offers a shared goblet, you try not to think too hard about what's floating in it. Welcome to dinner. You probably won't survive this. So, you didn't get poisoned by the wine goblet. Good. But now comes another minefield, where you sit, or more precisely, how you sit, why you sit there, and how everyone else feels about it. You've already avoided the royal end of the table, smart move, but even down here in the peasants with titles zone, things are tense. In the Middle Ages, a dinner table was a political map laid flat. Your place on it? A direct reflection of your worth. It didn't matter how hungry you were, how charming you felt, or how well you could recite Latin backwards. If your family name didn't sparkle with enough lineage or if your purse wasn't heavy enough, you were sitting downwind from the roast goose, and everyone knew it. The higher the rank, the closer you sat to the lord or king. If you were seated to their immediate right or left, oh, congratulations. You were either incredibly important, incredibly wealthy, or incredibly about to be married off to someone you've never met. Everyone else was sorted in careful gradients of social flavor. Knights, viscounts, distant cousins, in-laws who no one liked but couldn't be publicly exiled, all had their designated zones. Historians still debate whether these placements were meticulously planned by the steward each evening or whether guests knew instinctively where they belonged. Some argue that certain courts, especially in France, maintained actual charts or placement scrolls. Others say it was more of a vibe-based system, and everyone just quietly internalized their rank by the weight of their goblet and proximity to the warm dishes. But whatever the system, one rule remained consistent: never punch above your placement. You sit at a bench that wobbles just a little too much, across from a man who looks like he once bit someone in a duel. As platters pass you by, you notice something: food gets colder the farther it travels. Guests at the top of the table get first dibs on the choicest cuts, the crispest crusts, and the least suspicious-looking fish. By the time it reaches you, the roast has been manhandled, the gravy has congealed, and the once proud pudding looks a bit apologetic. And still, you're lucky. Some tables didn't even serve everyone. In massive feasts, particularly in royal courts like Edward IV's England or Charles V's Holy Roman Empire, food was offered based on rank alone. If you didn't make the cut, you were expected to smile politely and sip watery ale while others feasted inches away. An honor just to be invited, they'd say. Yes, an honor, and a lightly salted humiliation. Then there's the matter of who you're sitting next to. Courtly banquets doubled as networking events, matchmaking sessions, and subtle warfare. Sitting next to someone of equal rank? Comfortable. Someone higher? Intimidating. Someone lower? You're expected to be gracious, and yes, that's code for, don't visibly grimace if they chew with their mouth open. And seating could get personal. Entire alliances were built or broken over dinner placement. There's a documented instance where two noble families in Naples spent 4 generations feuding because one ancestor had been placed 3 seats below his rival during a ducal feast. 3 seats. That's the kind of historical pettiness that makes modern office politics look like a warm hug. You glance toward the top of the table again. The king is laughing at something, a joke you didn't hear, made by someone you'll never speak to. A servant immediately pours more wine into his goblet. Another slices meat directly onto his plate. If you squint, you'll notice something else: their knives are shinier. The bread is whiter. Even their salt comes in a fancier bowl. Salt, by the way, was more than just a condiment. It was a line in the sand. To sit above the salt was to sit among the elites. Below the salt? Well, enjoy your pottage. In noble English households, salt was placed midway on the table, and guests were seated accordingly. This expression actually stuck around for centuries. Even today, when someone says you're worth your salt, it's a distant echo of this briny class divide. Now, try not to look too eager. It's tempting to lean forward, make conversation, or, God forbid, ask for something. But remember, your role is to blend in. To behave. And definitely to not attract attention unless it's through passive admiration of the person seated 6 chairs ahead of you. Here comes the stew. You lean back just enough to let it pass, but your bench wobbles again. You make accidental eye contact with the steward. He makes a note on a tiny scroll. You hope it's not about you. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's something like, guest 27, suspicious elbows. A soft cough to your left. The man beside you is staring down at his plate. He's waiting, just like everyone else. The moment the Lord lifts his knife and makes the first cut, the entire table follows suit. It's a synchronized dance of chewing, nodding, and cautious small talk. Everyone is performing. Even you. But now you know better. This table isn't just about food. It's about power. And survival. And how gracefully you can pretend to enjoy a lukewarm fish pie while pretending not to notice that someone 2 seats ahead just got a second helping of pheasant, and you did not. You smile anyway. Welcome to dinner, where seating is fate, and fate rarely favors the hungry. By now, you've managed to find your seat, hold your knife correctly, and not be exiled for sniffing the king's pudding. But you're not safe yet. Because now comes the most spiritually ambiguous part of this whole medieval banquet, blessing the food, and silently begging it doesn't kill you. The first thing you notice is how serious everyone suddenly becomes. One moment, nobles are chuckling over hares in honey glaze, the next they're folding their hands, heads down, murmuring something between reverence and gastrointestinal dread. You do the same. You're not exactly sure who you're praying to, God, maybe? The cook? Your future self who might need stomach charcoal? It's unclear. In royal courts across medieval Europe, saying grace was more than just a nice gesture. It was vital. It was political. And, let's face it, it was desperately practical. Because let's be honest, you're about to eat food that's been roasting since noon in a smoky kitchen where rats probably have names. That stew might contain boar, or might just smell like boar. The wine could be sharp with age or sharp with vinegar. You never quite know. You glance around during the prayer. The clergy seated near the host are leading the moment, muttering Latin so fast it sounds like an incantation. Maybe it is. Some historians argue that these blessings serve not only as spiritual rituals, but as deeply social ones, giving the impression of divine order and control at an otherwise chaotic event. But here's the thing, nobody actually trusted the food. At least, not fully. Remember, this is an era where meat freshness was measured by smells less than death, and spices were used less for flavor and more for distraction. You could eat something that looked fine and find yourself praying again within the hour, but this time, from the floor. The blessing, then, served a second, unofficial purpose: culinary insurance. If you were going to eat something dodgy, it helped to know you had God's ear beforehand. It's like medieval diners thought, well, if I am about to swallow spoiled duck liver wrapped in cabbage, at least it's sanctified. And let's not forget the social pressure. Not bowing your head? That's a statement. That's rebellion. That's someone asking for trouble. You try to make your prayer face convincing. Soft squint. Brow slightly furrowed. A small nod for good measure. You peek. The noble woman across from you is doing the exact same thing. Perfect prayer posture. She might have practiced. Now, your nose twitches. Something smells strange. Is that cloves? Or a disguise? You shift your trencher bread slightly to the side and spot the first course, pottage. A hearty stew of vegetables, maybe a bit of meat, depending on the generosity of the host. And you really, really hope that's pork. Or maybe don't. It's hard to tell anymore. Another awkward truth about dinner in this era: the fear of food poisoning was real. Royal courts even kept full-time tasters, people paid to sample the king's food first, on the off chance it had been poisoned. And if you think that sounds glamorous, consider this: being a taster often meant chronic indigestion, missing fingers, don't ask, and the knowledge that every bite might be your last. Who knew dinner could be such a thrilling job hazard? Quirkily, some households took food protection to strange levels. In certain Germanic courts, salt would be blessed 3 times, and wine poured into silver goblets because silver was thought to detect poison. It didn't. But the placebo effect was strong in those days. There are even reports from the Spanish court of placing dried toads in the pantry to absorb toxins. Yes. Toads. Nature's little poison sponges, apparently. Historians still argue whether these rituals were taken seriously or were more symbolic, a performance of piety and caution wrapped up in tradition. But one thing's for sure, they did them. And you're doing them too now, because frankly, that pheasant looks a bit too glossy, and the last thing you want is to vomit in front of a duchess. There's also a superstition hanging in the air: mealtime blessings protect not just the body, but the soul. In medieval theology, consuming unblessed food was a bit like walking around barefoot during a thunderstorm. Spiritually speaking, it made you vulnerable. And in a world where demons, curses, and bad dreams were considered actual threats, nobody wanted to leave an opening. So everyone prayed. Even if they didn't believe in it fully. Even if they just wanted the meal to start. Even if they were secretly imagining that one friar from last week who choked on a bone during the second course. Yes, that really happened. His name was Brother Oswin. May he rest in peace and not come back as a dinner ghost. The prayer ends. The tension breaks. Wine is poured again, because in the Middle Ages, wine is medicine. Clean water? Unlikely. But fermented grape juice? Safer. Sort of. You raise your goblet for the first sip. The liquid is sharp, almost sour, but it warms your chest. For a brief moment, you feel victorious. You've passed your first true test, the ritual of the precarious blessing. But don't relax just yet. The stew is coming. And you're not sure whether the thing floating in it is a root vegetable or a boiled squirrel foot. Either way, you pray again. Quietly. Just in case. You've survived the stew. Barely. Now, you glance around as the next course arrives, hoping for something familiar, maybe some bread, maybe a nice roasted vegetable. What you get instead is a slab of meat, and no utensils. Not even a communal spoon. Just the meat. On your trencher. And then it hits you: you're supposed to eat this with your hands. That's not a mistake. That's the norm. Because in much of medieval Europe, the fork had not yet staged its glamorous debut. In fact, if you'd pulled one out of your pouch right now, you'd risk being seen as a heretic, a priss, or, worst of all, a Byzantine. See, forks were weird. Suspicious. Foreign. When they first arrived from the east via Venetian trade routes in the 11th and 12th centuries, most Western Europeans responded with a collective side-eye. "Who needs tiny metal fingers when God gave us perfectly good hands?" was the general consensus. One famous story, recounted in almost every quirky history book, tells of a Byzantine princess who brought a fork to her wedding banquet in Venice. She used it gracefully to eat delicate pastries. The church officials were horrified. Within a few years, she died of illness, and many claimed it was divine punishment for her forkish arrogance. So, yeah. You're probably better off not asking for one. What you do have is your trusty knife, remember, your personal one, the one you were expected to bring. It's multifunctional. You cut, you skewer, you nudge, and when absolutely necessary, you stab, into your meat, not your neighbor. Still, a knife alone won't get you through a slippery stew or a flaky pastry. Which brings us to fingers. Fingers were the true utensils of the medieval court. And not in a grabby, haphazard way. There were actual rules, elegant, fussy rules, on how to use your fingers to maintain nobility while also consuming what's essentially greasy mutton with some parsley sprinkled for illusion. For starters, use only 3 fingers, the thumb, the index, and the middle finger. The ring finger and pinky? Off limits. Using the full hand was considered vulgar, something a farmhand or commoner might do. You must pinch, lift, and bite with restraint. Imagine you're at a very stuffy picnic. That's the energy. You're handed what appears to be a roasted pigeon. It still has a slight shape to it, as though it only recently gave up its ambitions of flight. You try to lift it delicately with 3 fingers, but it's greasy. Your grip slips. It slaps onto your trencher with a sad wet sound. The noblewoman across from you doesn't blink. But the steward behind her raises a brow. You panic slightly. Reach for your napkin, except, surprise, there are no napkins. Or rather, there might be napkins, but they're probably decorative and meant for the upper ranks. You, humble guest at the edge of the table, must rely on either your trencher, your sleeve, or, if you're a true savage, your beard. Yes, your beard. In some courts, especially those in Northern Europe, it was perfectly acceptable for men to wipe their fingers on their beards mid-meal. The idea being that a nobleman's facial hair was thick enough to function as a kind of crumb catcher and grease sponge all in one. Modern historians mostly agree this was a thing. Some still argue whether it was encouraged or just tolerated. Either way, it happened. You, not having a beard, resort to the edge of your tunic. Not ideal. You'll have to sit like that the rest of the evening, oily fabric clinging to your forearm like a badge of dishonor. But you don't dare complain. Not when a minstrel is now singing about knights and falcons just behind you. The song, by the way, is lovely. But also distracting. You nearly miss the moment when someone tries to pass you a platter of honeyed carrots. It's heavy. You grab it, too fast, and a few carrots go tumbling onto the table. One lands near the goblet of a knight with questionable hygiene. He stares at you. You stare back. He grunts. You murmur an apology in Latinish. This is not going well. Now, amid all this, you notice something strange: people are actually licking their fingers. Casually. Gracefully, even. In fact, in certain courts, it was totally acceptable to do so, as long as it was done at the right time, in the right way, and never, ever after touching communal food. That was the key distinction: lick your own grease, not someone else's. Still, it feels weird. There's this constant tension between being refined and being, well, practical. You need to eat, and eating is messy. So court etiquette tried to make room for both. And sometimes, it got ridiculous. In the court of Louis IX, for instance, hand-washing rituals were theatrical. Servants would come by with bowls of rose water, linen cloths, and elaborate bows. Washing your hands before eating? Expected. Washing your hands again before dessert? Also expected. Washing your hands too often? Suspicious. Were you hiding something? Perhaps. And if you happen to have an open wound on your hand? You were not to touch the food at all. One noble in 13th century Aragon had to be spoon-fed by a page for the entirety of a banquet because of a minor thumb injury. True story. He never lived it down. By now, your own fingers are shiny. You've managed to eat half a bird, a few vegetables, and something that might have been a meat pie or possibly a mushroom experiment gone wrong. You look around for guidance. No one else seems bothered. This is just dinner. Awkward, oily, finger-based dinner. You take another bite, wipe your hand on your sleeve again, and make a mental note, tomorrow, you're packing a fork. Even if they accuse you of sorcery. You're 4 bites in and 2 sleeves down when a disaster nearly strikes, someone spills the salt. It's just a small dish, tipped by a clumsy elbow near the middle of the table, but the reaction is immediate. Conversation halts. Eyes widen. The steward lets out a faint gasp. One of the minstrels misses a note on his lute. And you, blessedly ignorant, are just sitting there wondering if you should help clean it up. Don't touch the salt. In the Middle Ages, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was symbolic. Holy. Political. Magical. To spill it was practically an omen, and a really bad one. This wasn't your modern table salt in a plastic shaker. This was coarse, expensive, hand-collected sea crystal gold. Wars had been fought for salt routes. Taxes levied on it. And at dinner, it was a marker, literally, of who mattered. Remember that, above the salt and below the salt seating rule? It wasn't just a phrase. A salt cellar would be placed prominently on the table, usually a lavish, decorative one, and nobles sat above it. You? Definitely below. If you even reached toward the salt uninvited, you might be accused of social climbing. Or witchcraft. Or worse, bad manners. Historians still argue whether this symbolic division was enforced with rigid protocol or just quietly observed. But there are records of guests being physically moved after someone noticed their fingers strayed too close to the salt. It was that serious. And here's the twist, spilled salt wasn't just unlucky. It had to be atoned for. Someone, often the one who knocked it, had to toss a pinch over their left shoulder. Why the left? Because that's where the devil sat, apparently, just waiting to sneak in during moments of human weakness, like seasoning accidents. You watch in fascination as the poor elbow spiller grimaces, picks up a pinch, and casually flicks it backward. He doesn't say anything. No one does. But there's a general murmur of approval, like a social reset button has just been pressed. Now you understand, every gesture here carries weight. Even the way you handle bread. Let's talk trenchers. That slab of stale bread in front of you? It's not a joke. It's your plate. And, eventually, your contribution to either the castle dogs, the local poor, or the compost heap. Made from coarse, thick loaves baked specifically to go hard and absorb juices, trenchers soaked up everything, the stew, the meat drippings, and even the occasional spilt ale. By the end of the meal, your trencher is basically a food sponge with dreams of being soup. You might wonder, do you eat it? Well, it depends. Eating your own trencher could be seen as lowly or greedy in some courts. In others, it was fine, especially if the Lord gave you a nod of approval or the food was too good to waste. But never, ever, eat someone else's trencher. That was borderline sacrilege. One overeager squire once did this in the Polish court, and was reportedly demoted to horse stable duty. For a year. And sharing food? That's where it gets complicated. Let's say someone passes you a piece of roasted fruit or a wedge of pie. Seems generous, right? But you must resist the temptation to bite it straight from their hand. That's only acceptable in the context of courtly love, which you, random guest number 17, are not currently part of. So instead, you nod, accept the offering, tear off a portion, and place it delicately on your trencher. Or, if you're trying to show off, you balance it on your knife and do a little wrist flick to your spot. Congratulations, you've just mastered the medieval food transfer ritual. No one claps, but they notice. And that's more important. But not all food sharing is polite. Let's say the person next to you dips their bread straight into a communal gravy bowl. That's a minor crime. If they do it twice? Major crime. Triple dip? We don't speak of what happens. The point is, communal dishes meant communal restraint. Hover, not dunk. Tear, not grab. And if you've been licking your fingers, definitely don't go back in for seconds. That brings us to another sacred zone of awkwardness, the drinking vessel. Yes, there are goblets on the table. No, they're not all yours. In many medieval courts, especially outside the highest-ranking guests, people shared goblets, just passed them around like musical chairs with backwash. You'll need to watch for the cue. If someone passes you a cup, you take it with a slight bow of the head, turn it so your lips don't touch theirs, and sip gracefully. Then wipe the rim with the corner of your sleeve or table linen, if you're lucky enough to have one, and pass it on. Do not chug. Do not swirl. Do not inspect the floaty bits. And whatever you do, don't spill. Wine was valuable. Ale was often safer than water. Mead had the power of surprise. If you spill it, especially on someone important, you might survive, but your reputation won't. Legend says a clumsy noble in the court of Charles VI once sloshed wine on the Queen's dog. She didn't speak to him for 3 years. As for the dog? Got a better seat the next feast. You sit back slightly. The salt has settled. Your trencher is holding steady. You've resisted double dipping. You've even survived a shared goblet from a man with suspiciously purple teeth. Not bad for your first feast. But deep down, you know this isn't over. There's a bowl of something jiggly being passed down, and a lot of side glances around the table. It smells sweet. But looks wrong. You ready your fingers, steady your sleeve, and silently curse the absence of forks. Welcome to medieval dinner. It's not just survival, it's interpretive dance with gravy. You've made it this far without committing a major social crime. That's impressive. But as the next course slides down the table toward you, a large, sloshing bowl of something brown and vaguely herbal, you realize your next challenge has arrived: soup. Ah yes. The great medieval equalizer. Whether you were a king, a knight, or a slightly overwhelmed guest with a questionable tunic stain, everyone struggled with soup. And with good reason, because unlike modern meals where each person gets a neat little bowl, here you're faced with a communal cauldron and a spoon that looks like it was carved by someone who's never actually used a spoon. And that's if you get a spoon at all. The thing about medieval dining is that spoons were optional, and when provided, they were usually made of wood, bone, or if you were very fancy, pewter. You might even be expected to bring your own. Did you pack one? No? That's fine. You can use bread, a polite slurp, or, if you're feeling bold, a confident lean and sip from the edge of the bowl. Just, don't get caught making noise. Because here's the kicker, slurping was frowned upon. In fact, it could ruin your reputation faster than asking for a second trencher. Medieval etiquette books, yes, they had those, specifically warned against noisy suckings of broth and the vile sputter of lips upon soup. Apparently, even in a world where people wiped their fingers on dogs and used bread as plates, noisy soup eating was simply too far. Historians still argue whether slurping bans were universal or varied by region. Some courts in Italy were reportedly more forgiving, especially during garlic-heavy feasts, but in France and England, the upper classes treated soup with hushed reverence, like it contained the secrets of the Holy Grail. So there you are. No spoon. A bowl of mystery stew. Everyone watching. You reach for the nearest ladle, a handle carved with what might be a dragon or a very tired snake, and scoop out a portion. Carefully. Slowly. With a wrist technique that says, I belong here, even though your inner monologue is screaming, what is this smell? You bring it to your trencher. The liquid runs off. Of course it does. Your trencher is bread. This was not a smart idea. Instead, you do what many others do, lean in. Dip the side of your trencher into the bowl. Absorb. Bite. Nod. Pretend. This is medieval dinner strategy at its finest. Look confident while your bread surrenders to soup. And then comes the spoon confusion. If you're lucky enough to have one, there's still the question of how to use it. Do you sip straight from it? Let it hover near your lips? Should you blow on hot broth? Hint, no. Apparently that was too peasant-like for high society. Suffering in silence was preferred. In one legendary court tale from Burgundy, a noblewoman was scolded for pursing her lips like a fish while cooling her soup. A bishop watching reportedly coughed loud enough to make her drop the spoon. She never slurped again. You lift your borrowed spoon. It's a little warped. The edges are uneven. The handle's too short. You angle it toward your mouth and sip as delicately as possible. It tastes earthy. Not bad, actually. But there's a hint of something else. Garlic, maybe? Onion? No. Wait. That's definitely clove. A lot of clove. Medieval cooks loved their spices. And not just to show off. Spices masked spoilage. They also communicated wealth. Clove, cinnamon, saffron, these weren't just flavors, they were social statements. The more your stew burned your nose, the more your host was saying, yes, I have trade connections. Behold my fancy soup. You look down at your spoon. There's something floating in it. Something squishy. Maybe a mushroom. Or a snail. Or an unlucky dumpling that's seen things. You power through. Smile. Pretend it's intentional. Then someone bumps the bowl. It rocks. Soup sloshes. You watch in horror as a glob lands in the lap of the man 2 seats down. He freezes. The table freezes. You freeze. And then, a laugh. A small one. Dry. Controlled. And just like that, the tension breaks. A servant rushes in with a cloth. The soup victim waves him away. No duel. No exile. Just a very wet tunic and a few awkward nods. Lucky you. Still, it's a reminder that communal bowls are a battlefield. One wrong move, one jostled elbow, and suddenly you're responsible for a noble's broth-soaked breeches. You resolve to be more careful. You cradle your spoon like it's made of glass and use it only when absolutely necessary. Some courts try to avoid these issues by using double spooning etiquette. One spoon for scooping from the communal bowl, another for your mouth. This system, however, often failed because no one ever remembered which was which, especially after the third goblet of spiced wine. And just when you think you've figured it out, someone reaches across the table to dip their trencher into the communal bowl, right after licking their fingers. You die a little inside. No one says anything. But a few eyebrows twitch. Food sharing, as you now understand, is a fine balance between intimacy and revulsion. At royal courts, it was often a gesture of unity, like toasting, but it could quickly cross into insult. Offering someone your spoon? Sweet. Accidentally flinging a chunk of barley stew into their goblet? Less so. By the end of the soup course, you're emotionally drained. Your tunic smells like herbs. Your trencher has begun to dissolve into a sad, soggy bread island. And your spoon, well, you're no longer sure whose it was to begin with. You lean back. Politely wipe your mouth with your sleeve, again. And exhale. That, dear guest, was soup. You made it. You're practically nobility now. The soup has passed, your sleeves are soaked, and your dignity is hanging on by a breadcrumb. But don't rest yet. Now comes another delightfully awkward dilemma in this medieval masquerade of manners: how to clean your hands and face when everything is drenched in goose grease, and napkins are as rare as mercy at a tax audit. Let's talk napkins. Or rather, the strange, inconsistent, often imaginary world of napkin etiquette in the Middle Ages. In the modern world, napkins are predictable: there's one on your lap, or folded neatly on your plate, ready to dab at that speck of sauce with no social consequences. Not here. Not now. In most medieval royal courts, napkins were reserved for the elite, often woven from fine linen, embroidered for style points, and usually big enough to be mistaken for a cape. But unless you're seated within spitting distance of a crown, you're probably not getting one. Instead, there are alternatives. None of them good. Option 1, the tablecloth. Yes, it's technically for decoration. Yes, it's incredibly frowned upon. But desperate guests would sometimes, accidentally, drag their hands across the edge of the cloth when no one was looking. If caught, you could be shamed publicly or, worse, relegated to the stone bench next feast. That's not just seating demotion. That's exile with a view of the latrines. Option 2, your own clothes. This is the people's choice. That grease-glossed wool tunic you wore with pride? It's now doubling as a personal towel. You discreetly swipe a hand down the inside of your sleeve. No one seems to notice. Or maybe they do. But they won't say anything, unless they're looking for a reason to laugh about the guest who bathed in his own gravy. Option 3. Beards. Ah yes, the forgotten medieval Swiss Army knife. If you have one, use it. A wipe here, a dab there, it's the poor man's linen. There's even record of a knight at the court of Henry III who boasted that his beard could filter broth and polish a pewter spoon in a single swipe. Charming. And terrifying. If you don't have a beard, you better start growing one before the next feast. And just when you think you've figured out your rhythm, dab discreetly, chew politely, someone at the far end of the table sneezes. Loudly. A pause. All eyes turn. The sneezer looks mildly embarrassed. The lord at the head of the table mutters a blessing. And that's your cue to mutter one, too. Because in the Middle Ages, sneezes weren't just bodily eruptions. They were spiritual events. Some believed they were signs of demonic expulsion. Others thought the soul briefly exited the body, hence the quick blessing to call it back before something else snuck in. Either way, ignoring a sneeze was like ignoring someone declaring war. You offer a quick "God bless" under your breath. Just to be safe. But now back to your hands, which, despite your best efforts, still resemble something between a candle and a roasted ham. You scan the room for the lavabo servant. That's the guy with the water basin and towel. He usually does the pre- and post-meal rounds. But he's currently helping the count of something or other scrape eel jelly off his doublet. You are very much on your own. Historically, handwashing at feasts was treated with near-sacramental reverence. In some courts, like those in Castile or the Holy Roman Empire, the arrival of the handwashing basin was an event. Trumpets, fancy towels, maybe even a scented oil poured over your fingers. The idea wasn't just hygiene, it was a declaration of status. Look at me, washing my hands with rose water while peasants eat moss. Historians still debate whether this ritual was rooted more in sanitation or symbolism. Sure, clean hands were nice. But mostly, it was about the performance. Just like everything else at these meals. Eating was theater. And you? You're currently the understudy with mustard on your chin. You glance to your left. The noble beside you has solved the hand-cleaning problem in his own way, by doing nothing at all. He's letting the grease glow. Some diners embraced the mess as a mark of satisfaction. A kind of culinary badge of honor. Yes, I am covered in duck fat. And yes, I was worth that duck. That's one strategy. Meanwhile, a woman across the table is holding up a delicate sprig of herbs. She's not about to eat it. No, she's sniffing it. Because in the absence of napkins, another noble trick was to carry small bundles of aromatic herbs, called nosegays or posies, to hold near the nose as a kind of scent shield. Not only did it help with the stench of the room, the guests, the goats, it also gave you something to do with your hands between courses. You don't have one of these herbal lifesavers. But you do spot a garnish on a nearby platter, maybe mint? You discreetly pinch a leaf and tuck it near your wrist. There. Classy. Medicinal. Probably minty. Now let's not forget the public face-cleaning faux pas, perhaps the most mortifying of all. Say you get a smear of pie on your cheek. Do you A. Lick your finger and wipe it? B. Ask your neighbor for help? C. Pretend it isn't there until it dries into a facial fossil? The correct answer, none of the above. Facial wiping was supposed to be done privately, subtly, and preferably behind a goblet or fan. Once, in the court of a minor Saxon prince, a baron openly dabbed his nose with a sausage-soaked linen and was banned from feasts for a season. You don't want to be that guy. History is still laughing at him. Eventually, the lavabo servant arrives at your end of the table. He carries a pewter basin, a damp cloth, and the distinct expression of someone who's already seen too much. You extend your hands. He pours. You rinse. The water runs brown. He doesn't flinch. You dry your fingers on the cloth, give a grateful nod, and lean back. Clean hands. Wiped face. Scented garnish. You feel almost regal. Until you look down and realize your trencher has absorbed half a duck leg and is now oozing into your lap. You calmly reposition it. Smile. Carry on. This is fine. This is noble. This is medieval. You're cleanish now, your fingers no longer resemble medieval torches, and your sleeves are only moderately sticky. You take a breath, sip cautiously from the shared goblet, after inspecting it for floaters, and try to relax. That's when it happens. A man 2 seats down lets out a thunderous belch. Not just a little polite release of pressure, mind you, this is the kind of belch that echoes off the stone walls and briefly silences the minstrel in mid-verse. You freeze. What are you supposed to do? Applaud? Pretend it didn't happen? Cry a little? It turns out that in many medieval courts, belching wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. At least in the right context. Depending on where you were in Europe, a hearty post-meal burp could be seen as a compliment to the chef. In fact, failing to do so might be taken as a subtle insult, like you were holding back, or worse, still hungry. Of course, context mattered. At a casual hunting lodge with a duke and some venison on the spit? Belch away, friend. But at a royal banquet with foreign dignitaries present? You'd better clench that diaphragm like your honor depended on it. This is the delicate dance of bodily functions in the Middle Ages, a blend of praise, peril, and unpredictable social landmines. The rules were rarely written down. They lived in the sideways glances, the forced coughs, the long silences that followed accidental sounds from the lower regions. Everyone knew them, no one discussed them, and breaking them could either make you the hero of the evening, or the unfortunate topic of minstrel mockery for generations. Historians still argue about the etiquette surrounding these bodily expressions. Some sources suggest that certain courts, especially in Germanic regions, embraced full-throated appreciation noises, while others, particularly those influenced by more Romanesque traditions, preferred their nobles silent, repressed, and backed up for eternity. You try to walk the line. A light burp bubbles in your throat. You suppress it. Swallow. Smile. Your reward? A mild, spicy aftertaste and a sense of internal pride. You're playing it safe tonight. Smart. But not everyone is. The man who belched. He's now launching into a story about how, at last year's feast, he accidentally passed gas near the Earl of Westmarch and still got invited back. Everyone laughs. Except the Earl of Westmarch. You don't know who he is, but based on the narrowed eyes at the far end of the table, you're guessing he's not thrilled about the memory. Meanwhile, another guest sneezes mid-bite and sprays a fine mist of wine-soaked bread onto the person beside him. There is no recovery from this. The victim stiffens. A servant arrives with a damp cloth before blood can be drawn. You suddenly feel very, very lucky to be seated in the middle of the pack zone. It's not just belching and sneezing, though. The entire medieval dinner table was a war zone of bodily management. Imagine sitting for 3 hours in wool layers, under candle heat, surrounded by strong smells, spiced wine, and unrefrigerated meats. Things happened. And people tried their best to pretend they didn't. One royal banquet in Bohemia became infamous when a guest fainted from the heat, slumped sideways, and landed face first in the marzipan sculpture of St. Peter. The king reportedly declared it a sign from heaven and ordered the marzipan shared as a holy dessert. Whether this was gracious or just absurd damage control remains hotly debated by food historians. You sip your wine. You try to look calm. But your stomach is beginning to gurgle in that way that says, we might have a situation soon. Was it the stew? The meat pie? The trenchers absorbing strange sauces like culinary sponges? Doesn't matter. You are now facing your next big challenge, not making a scene. In some courts, nobles were allowed to quietly excuse themselves during the meal. In others, leaving the table was seen as a deep insult to the host. One wrong move, and you might be accused of snubbing the meal, the company, or even the local bishop who just told his 5th story about miracle cheese. So you sit. You breathe. You distract yourself by focusing on the blessings being murmured again, now that the main course is winding down. Yes, another prayer. Sometimes a second grace was said mid-meal to thank God for survival, or perhaps as a spiritual plea to continue surviving, depending on how the mutton sat. You catch yourself wondering, was that second bite even mutton? You push the thought away. Now here's something truly bizarre. In certain parts of medieval Spain, there was an actual etiquette for silent digestion. One monk's guide advised nobles to sit upright, smile, and allow the body to process in peace, lest one's bowels speak louder than the tongue. A noble art, that. Of course, not everyone followed such guides. Some nobles embraced the chaos. There are records of guests bragging about their post-feast endurance, how many courses they could endure, how loudly they could burp, and once, at the French court, how many pickled eels one could consume before needing to lie under the table. That last one became a competition. No one won. So where do you fall in all this? Somewhere between quiet burper and praying for internal peace. You sit tall. You smile. You nod politely at a nearby toast. And when someone 2 seats away sneezes for the 3rd time, you offer a sincere, slightly panicked God bless. Because if that's the plague, you're definitely not getting dessert. You've survived soup disasters, shared goblets, finger-licking shame, and a whole chapter's worth of gastrointestinal roulette. But now, just as the tension begins to loosen like your belt, assuming you still have one, you encounter one of the most feared figures in the medieval court. The loud chewer. He's not doing anything technically wrong. He's not insulting the king or stabbing anyone with a serving knife. But with every bite, crunch, smack, chomp, slurp, he is committing a most egregious social sin. And what's worse? He doesn't care. Loud chewing was the medieval equivalent of public flatulence at a royal wedding. Yes, it happened. Yes, sometimes it was unintentional. But when it was consistent and performed with gusto, it marked you as a person of dubious breeding, or worse, a boor. That's an actual term they used. A boor. You don't want to be a boor. You glance around. Everyone has heard it. Everyone is trying not to react. The woman across from you is subtly tilting her goblet toward her ear like a noise-canceling headset. A page boy visibly flinches with each new clomp. Even the jester stops juggling poultry to stare. And yet, the chewer remains unfazed. Historians still debate whether loud chewing was universally scorned in all courts, or if it varied depending on culture and class. Some sources suggest that in certain Scandinavian banquets, open-mouth chewing was tolerated as a sign of enthusiasm. In other regions, especially those influenced by chivalric codes, table grace was as important as swordsmanship. One well-documented case from the Burgundian court tells of a noblewoman who demanded an annulment because her betrothed chewed like a sow devouring a cabbage. The request was denied, but the wedding feast was permanently remembered as the crunchening. No joke, scribes actually gave it a name. You, being a guest of unknown rank, try to neutralize the situation. You sip. You nod. You attempt to look both sympathetic and deeply absorbed in your trencher's slow decline into soup sponge status. But deep down, you know, this isn't just about chewing. It's about control. A court feast wasn't just a meal, it was a demonstration of composure. A chance to show that you could endure 6 courses of meat, flaming desserts, ambient goat odors, and still keep your dignity intact. A quiet chew was like a secret handshake. A loud one? A declaration of anarchy. Still, you can't help but steal another glance at the offender. He's gnawing through a drumstick now, bones cracking, grease flying, making noises that would terrify a stable rat. The only person less bothered is his dinner companion, who is also chewing like he's auditioning to become a human millstone. Maybe it's a regional thing. Or maybe they're just drunk. You're halfway through contemplating whether to chew more softly in protest when you remember something important. You're not here for justice. You're here to survive. So you switch tactics. Focus on your own chewing. Chew with purpose. Quietly. Elegantly. One of the etiquette manuals from the 14th century literally says, "Let not thy jaws make music as thou eatest." That's your new mantra. You imagine chewing in silence so refined, angels take notes. And yet, because medieval life is chaos wrapped in a crust of etiquette, no one ever wrote down an exact rulebook. Oh, sure, there were guides. The Babe's Book, Le Ménagier de Paris, and a dozen other moralistic instruction texts gave suggestions like, "Do not gnaw bones like a dog," or, "Keep not thy lips wet with wine whilst thou speakest." But chewing? Mostly a gray area, left to the listener's judgment, and easily weaponized in court gossip. That's the real danger. Not being caught by the host, but becoming a story. You imagine the post-feast chatter. "Did you see the way guest 27 gnawed that carrot? I thought the marrow would come flying out." You shiver. The only thing worse than being remembered is being remembered for chewing. Then, suddenly, a saving grace, entertainment. The doors open. A juggler enters, trailing scarves and ribbons, followed by a man playing a very high-pitched flute. The room's attention shifts. The chewer pauses. You nearly weep with relief. But here's the twist, entertainment during meals didn't mean, stop eating. It meant, eat while smiling, clapping, and occasionally pretending to understand what's happening. The court's version of dinner theater. And while you're still chewing as silently as humanly possible, the next test begins. Can you multitask like a noble? A small monkey in a tiny vest rides in on a dog. No one reacts. This, apparently, is normal. As the monkey performs somersaults, you chew, softly. A juggler balances a pie on his head. You nod, chew, and pretend not to see the pie slowly slide. A singer in velvet belts a song about knights who woo with waffles. You smile faintly and chew your carrot in rhythm. And then, as if summoned by the gods of discomfort, the loud chewer returns to form. This time, with a roast figure a soft food. And yet somehow, he makes it squelch. You close your eyes. This is your trial. The Holy Roman Emperor once had a food taster. You need a chew deflector. Or perhaps a long spoon and a short table. But you endure. Because this is court life. And the only thing worse than being a loud chewer, is being the one who reacts to the loud chewer. So you smile. Chew quietly. And plan to tell this story to literally everyone the moment you're safely back at your own table. The jester has finished juggling meat pies. The monkey has taken a bow. The lute player is softly plucking something mournful in a corner. And now, as platters shift again and new trays of roasted mystery meats arrive, you find yourself entering a realm that modern etiquette simply cannot prepare you for. The medieval art of sharing food, gallant or gross. You're handed a drumstick. Half-eaten. Not by you. The man beside you smiles and gestures warmly. He means well. This is a gesture of camaraderie. A symbol of goodwill. An invitation to bond over gristle. You blink. Do you take it? In many medieval courts, especially those obsessed with chivalry, sharing food was a sign of trust and intimacy. Not in a romantic way, though sometimes it could be that too, but in a, we're all sweating through wool together, and if I give you this hunk of swan, it means I think you're decent, kind of way. Of course, not all food sharing was equal. There's a massive difference between offering someone a slice of pie and offering them the part of your goose that's already glistening from your teeth marks. The former is charming. The latter is bold. You smile back, nod politely, and carefully tear a portion of untouched meat from the far side. Very smooth. He nods in approval. You just passed a test you didn't know you were taking. Here's the thing, communal eating was normal. Dishes were shared. Platters were passed. Goblets were rotated like sacred relics of backwash. You were expected to participate. Not doing so could read as standoffish or even insulting. But there were unspoken rules. Rule 1, never reach with a licked finger. Seems obvious, but you'd be surprised. One overly eager squire once got sent to the kitchens for double-dipping his candied almonds during a bishop's visit. Historians agree, deserved. Rule 2, share only what's clean. If you've taken a bite, don't offer what's left. If you must share from something partially eaten, break off a fresh piece, place it on your knife blade, and offer it gracefully, like a tiny edible proposal. This wasn't just polite, it was theater. And Rule 3, never refuse a gift outright. That's delicate. If someone offers you their food, and you recoil like it's a plague biscuit, you've essentially insulted not just their hygiene, but their entire house. You must accept it somehow, even if it's just symbolically. Maybe you touch it, smile, and place it aside with reverence. That's a win. Some medieval romances even feature knights sharing food as a bonding ritual. He offered her a peach from his own trencher, and she bit it where he had bitten. Yes, that's an actual 13th century line. Sweet. Weird. Potentially unsanitary. But sweet. Meanwhile, your trencher, once a noble slab of crusty bread, is now a soggy mess of sauce, bits, and something unidentifiable that wriggles when touched. Sharing from that? Not advised. You give it a sideways glance and quietly slide your goblet a few inches to block it from view. Now, here comes another test. A noblewoman to your left lifts a fig, plump, glistening, perfumed, and holds it out toward you. No plate. No knife. Just fingers. Hers. Yours. This is probably flirting. And yes, that's a thing. In the high courts of France, Italy, and some surprisingly spicy parts of medieval England, sharing food was often a covert form of courtly affection. A cherry placed on someone's trencher? Intrigue. A slice of honeyed tart passed hand to hand? Very suggestive. Feeding directly from your fingers? Scandalous. Also thrilling. But beware, flirting through food was risky business. In one tale from Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, a knight passed a lady a sugared almond with such flair that her husband challenged him to a duel. The almond was never recovered. So, back to your fig. You lean forward, smile graciously, and accept it on the flat of your palm. No direct finger contact. No biting in view. You place it beside your cup. She nods. The transaction is complete. You are now maybe flirting, maybe just polite, and definitely not dueling anyone. Let's not forget the practical downsides of sharing. Germ theory didn't exist, but people weren't oblivious. They noticed that illness often followed feasts. That guests who drank from the same goblet sometimes fell ill together. That food handled too many times ended up tasting more like hands than actual ingredients. To combat this, some households began developing subtle hygienic habits: separate serving knives, wiping goblet rims between sips, even designated dipping corners on sauce platters. Primitive, sure. But progress. You notice a servant now walking down the table with what appears to be a bowl of communal dipping sauce. Thick, dark, enticing. The guest next to you plunges his meat chunk in with enthusiasm. You pause. Wait. Then take a clean bit of crust and gently tap the very edge of the bowl. Minimal contact. Maximum flavor. You win again. But not everyone is so thoughtful. Down the table, a knight is using the communal honey pot like it's a personal jar of jam. A spoon enters, licks, re-enters. The jester audibly groans. A scandal brews. Someone mutters, "Barbarian." You pretend not to notice. That's safest. And now comes the big finale, dessert sharing. It's not just about sweetness. It's about status. Not everyone gets dessert. If it reaches your part of the table at all, it's a compliment. A custard tart passed to you? A nod of inclusion. A slice of quince jelly paired with a wink? Possibly a job offer. Or marriage. Or both. You receive half a pear poached in spiced wine, already split. The noble who passes it to you has impeccable sleeves and a mysterious smile. You nod. Take the half. Place it gently beside your goblet. You've made it. You've shared without contaminating. Flirted without scandal. Avoided becoming a chew-based cautionary tale. And most importantly, you still have your seat. For now. The lights, or rather, the flickering wall sconces, dim just a little, the dishes grow smaller and sweeter, and something strange starts to happen around you. People begin to flirt over poultry. You blink, thinking maybe the wine is finally getting to you. But no. That very composed baroness just passed a chunk of roast partridge to a young knight using only her eyes and a slight tilt of her spoon. And he, noble warrior that he is, caught the message and responded with an exaggerated sip of wine. Welcome to courtly love, dinner edition. In the medieval world, especially at royal banquets, meals weren't just about eating. They were about politics, alliances, appearances, and yes, the gentle art of romantic suggestion delivered via pudding. You're not just witnessing a feast. You're watching a social chess match, and every morsel is a move. In courts like those of Eleanor of Aquitaine or the Valois kings of France, courtly love was its own elaborate system. A nobleman might show affection by passing a carefully carved piece of pear to a lady, or dipping his bread into her sauce, and yes, that sounded suggestive even then. A lady might return the gesture with a glance, a faint smile, or if she was feeling bold, a cherry pressed lightly into his hand. Historians still argue how much of this was genuine desire and how much was performance, a stylized, symbolic game with its own rules, never meant to lead to anything scandalous. In some courts, it was even encouraged, so long as it stayed playful. Others took a stricter view: one wrong pastry passed, and you might find yourself wed to someone unexpectedly. You, meanwhile, are simply trying to not dip your duck in someone else's gravy by accident. But that gets tricky, because in this phase of the feast, everything is shared. Platters with sugared almonds, candied violets, tiny baked apples, and delicately spiced fowl are passed from hand to hand. A glance here, a lingering offer there, it's a language. And you're just starting to learn the alphabet. A young woman next to you, possibly a noble, possibly just sitting above her pay grade, leans slightly in your direction. She says nothing. She takes a fig, presses it between two fingers, and places it on the edge of your trencher. Not a word. Then she returns to her roast. You're not sure what just happened. But it feels important. Or terrifying. Maybe both. Here's the thing: every action at the medieval table meant something. Where you looked. Whose food you accepted. Even how you held your goblet. A raised cup, held out slightly to the left. Polite salute. Tipped too far. Flirtation. Tipped not at all. Snub. You didn't just drink, you communicated through sipping. A famous case from Burgundy tells of a duke who passed a slice of pear to his mistress at a banquet while ignoring his actual wife seated across from him. The next day, there were rumors. 2 weeks later, a minor rebellion. That pear changed history. So now, back to you. You delicately move the fig toward the edge of your trencher, acknowledging, but not overeager. Very diplomatic. The woman smiles. You've passed another test. Meanwhile, another guest across the table is absolutely failing his. He loudly offers a wedge of cheese to the lady beside him, explaining that it reminds him of her grace. She, gracefully, ignores him. Someone coughs. Someone else whispers something that definitely contains the phrase, goat-brained. You sip your wine and silently pledge never to use cheese as a metaphor again. But not all romantic overtures are disasters. Some are strangely poetic. A knight might recite a verse before passing a dessert. A lady might trace a pattern on the tablecloth with her spoon. And in one wildly dramatic court, We're Looking at You, Castile, a noble once carved a poem into a baked apple and rolled it down the table. The recipient married him. Probably because no one else wanted to eat poetry. Of course, flirting at a feast had to be subtle. Too obvious, and you invited scandal. Too subtle, and you got ignored. It was a tightrope walk over a table of tripe and expectations. And let's not forget the risk of accidental flirtation. Imagine handing someone a sweetmeat out of sheer politeness, only to discover you've unknowingly proposed an affair. It happened. Often. There's even record of a Hungarian nobleman whose offhand fruit pass to a duchess led to 3 weeks of confusion, 2 family meetings, and eventually a wedding. You decide to err on the side of caution. You eat quietly. You smile at no one in particular. But then, another fig appears. Different guest. Similar glance. You begin to wonder, maybe it's not about romance. Maybe it's just about seeing who understands the code. Because that's what court life is, codes on top of codes, layered in sauce, sprinkled with cinnamon, and passed down the table like a sugared secret. Eventually, dessert courses wind down. Trays are cleared. Fingers are wiped, mostly on clothing. The music softens. A few guests begin rising, bowing, stepping away from the table. And just before you stand, the woman beside you passes you one final cherry. You take it. Say nothing. She nods. No scandal. No expectation. Just a shared cherry. Which, in this strange, etiquette-choked world of meat and manners, feels like something close to victory. The cherry has been passed, the dessert trays are nearly empty, and a few nobles are already easing back from the table with exaggerated sighs and satisfied grunts. You consider standing too, but then, something curious happens. The king sneezes. Not a polite little sniffle. No. This is a full-body, echoing, thunderclap of a sneeze that sends the jewel on his crown rattling and a terrified juggler nearly dropping his spoons. And in that moment, the entire table freezes. It's not just about the king sneezing, it's about what happens next. Because now, the entire etiquette machinery of the royal court springs into action, and you realize, every natural human reflex has rules in this place. First comes the blessing. A collective, murmured, "God save the king." That's standard. But then, no one moves. No food is touched. No goblets lifted. No jesters jest. It's like the room itself has inhaled and doesn't dare exhale until the king dabs his nose and gives some sign that the universe may continue. You sit still, hands in your lap, trencher pushed away. A bead of gravy clings to your sleeve. You do not wipe it. You do not breathe too loudly. Because here's the deal, when royalty performs a bodily function, no matter how minor, you respond appropriately, or you don't respond at all and pray that was the right choice. Historians still debate just how rigid these expectations were. Some say kings intentionally exaggerated sneezes to remind the room of their power. Others argue that entire etiquette handbooks were built around these exact awkward moments, pages dedicated to what to do when His Majesty coughs mid-pie. But no matter which theory you believe, one thing is certain, you must never upstage the king. This is where the real performance of medieval feasting takes place. It's not just food, it's hierarchy in edible form. Everything is a reminder of rank, who gets served first, who's allowed to speak during a toast, and yes, who gets to sneeze without consequence. You remember a story you once overheard. A minor noble in the court of Charles VI laughed, just chuckled, at a poorly timed royal hiccup. He was sent to pray alone for 3 months in a monastery that reportedly had more goats than monks. So here you are, lips pressed tight, eyes respectfully lowered, trying not to exist too loudly. Eventually, the king lifts his goblet, takes a slow sip, and gives a tiny nod. The feast resumes. The tension breaks like a roast crust. Conversation restarts in cautious waves. You hear the familiar sounds, spoons scraping, chairs creaking, someone telling a story about a flaming pudding incident involving a bishop's wig. You resume sipping your wine, grateful that your fate doesn't currently rest on a nasal explosion. But this whole event has taught you something valuable. The table pauses for the crown. Always. And it's not just sneezes. If the king starts laughing, you laugh. If he suddenly frowns at his dish, you don't touch yours. If he sighs heavily and pokes at his pudding, you too develop an immediate emotional concern about your pudding. Court etiquette is mimicry elevated to survival art. Of course, this extends beyond the king. Even minor nobility often had micro-expectations. Did the duchess clap at the jester? You should clap too. Did the marquis raise his eyebrows at the soup? Better skip your spoon. The higher the rank, the more power they have to dictate the tone, and every guest becomes a nervous mirror. One well-recorded case from the English court tells of a guest who sipped from his goblet before the queen did. He was swiftly reprimanded. Not by the queen herself, she didn't need to lift a finger. The steward simply coughed, and 2 guards gently relocated the guest to observe the rest of the feast from a more humble position. That humble position was reportedly outside. In the rain. So when you see the Earl 3 seats ahead raise his napkin, a real one, embroidered, you subtly mimic the gesture. When the princess laughs, softly, you let out a quiet chuckle of your own. Not too loud. Not too eager. Just enough to blend. Because blending is the ultimate goal of the middle-ranked guest, not to stand out, but not to disappear entirely. You're doing well, until someone at your table makes the most rookie mistake of the evening. They start talking during a royal toast. It's not even a long speech. Just a simple raising of the cup, a few solemn words honoring the Holy Mother, and maybe the king's dead cousin. It's hard to tell with the accent. But the moment the guest starts chatting, probably about pie, the steward claps once, loudly. The room goes still. Again. The offending guest lowers their voice. Too late. The damage is done. They'll be remembered, not by name, but as the one who talked during the toast. A fate worse than lukewarm eel. Eventually, the toast ends. Goblets are raised. You raise yours slightly too late, but just early enough not to seem disrespectful. The king drinks. So do you. Crisis averted. There's a rhythm to it now: watch, wait, mimic. Pause, glance, chew. The rules are absurd, yes. But once you learn the melody, the court starts to feel almost, dare you say it, comfortable. And then, mid-sip, the queen yawns. Just a little. But enough. Half the room subtly adjusts. A few guests sit straighter. A few others begin signaling for attendance. Because everyone knows, when the queen yawns, the feast is nearing its final act. You smile to yourself. You made it through the king's sneeze, the duchess's giggle, and the great fig flirt of 20 minutes ago. And unless someone drops a goblet or launches into a spontaneous lute solo, you just might make it to the end of this feast with your dignity intact. The queen has yawned. The musicians are now plucking slower, softer tunes. You can feel the energy of the feast shifting like candlelight in a draught, less triumphant, more tired. Guests start loosening belts, adjusting sleeves, whispering about upcoming hunting parties and overdue debts. You begin to think, finally, it's winding down. And then a dog jumps onto the table. Not just any dog. A tiny, trembling, silk ribbon thing with more jewelry than some barons, now strutting across the trenchers like it owns the place. Its little paws press directly into someone's pear tart, and no one seems surprised. Because here's something no etiquette scroll warned you about: pets at the table weren't just tolerated in medieval courts, sometimes they were the honored guests. Yes, really. In courts across Europe, from France to Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, nobility often brought their most beloved animals to dinner. Tiny lapdogs, monkeys in miniature vests, falcons on gloved hands, and once, in a Polish duchy, a goose that wore boots. These creatures weren't just pets, they were status symbols, living accessories that offered comfort, distraction, and in many cases, conversation escape hatches. You don't want to talk to the Earl of Nosebleeds? Pet the dog. You're seated next to the man who chews like a thresher. Compliment his monkey. It's a system. The dog, possibly a greyhound puppy with attitude, sniffs your trencher. You freeze. If you shoo it, you risk insulting its noble owner. If you feed it, you risk encouraging a fur-covered landslide of bread and boar. You choose the diplomatic middle, lean slightly back, offer a mild smile, and hope the dog senses your neutrality. It does not. It sneezes on your sleeve and moves on to the bishop's pudding. You dab the spot with a linen square that may or may not have belonged to the jester. No one notices. Or if they do, they pretend not to. That's the trick at this point in the evening: see everything, acknowledge nothing. Still, it's hard not to gawk when a monkey in a blue tunic and tiny cap jumps from shoulder to shoulder before stealing a fig off a silver tray. A noblewoman laughs. The steward does not. You're beginning to understand that the rules apply until they don't. And that line is often determined by who owns the animal. There's a legendary tale, told, retold, and wildly exaggerated, about a greyhound belonging to Margaret of Anjou that reportedly bit a visiting noble during dinner. Did Margaret apologize? No. She reportedly said, "He must have smelled like a liar." The noble laughed nervously. He left court 2 days later. Without the dog bite, he might have become a duke. The medieval feast wasn't just a place of pomp and pageantry. It was an ecosystem, and pets were part of that balance. Dogs begged and were fed bits of meat from gloved hands. Birds perched on shoulders and sometimes stole garnishes mid-toast. A spoiled ferret once drank wine from a duchess's goblet and later had to be escorted out by a knight in full armor. Historians still argue whether the presence of animals at royal feasts was an indulgence or a carefully curated display of control. Some suggest it showed rulers as benevolent, in touch with nature. Others say it was a test: could you maintain dignity while a cat slept on your trencher? If yes, welcome to court. If no, back to the monastery with you. You've decided to play it safe. You eat around the paw print in your bread. You don't look surprised when the monkey drops a grape down the back of a page boy's collar. You simply nod. Sip. Continue. Then the greyhound returns. The one from earlier. Bigger than before, or maybe it just seems that way now that it's standing directly behind your chair. It whines softly. You can feel everyone watching, waiting to see what you'll do. You tear off a small piece of meat. Hold it up. The dog accepts it, gently. Then lies down. By your feet. This, you realize, might be the highest compliment you'll receive all night. In some courts, dogs chose favorites. If a noble's hound curled beneath your bench, it was a signal: this person is safe. Clean. Worthy of scraps. In fact, a few feasts even recorded such events in the official log. The Lord of Briar Hollow was favored by Lady Albrecht's spaniel. It sounds silly now. Back then? It was practically a letter of recommendation. So now you sit, meat-smeared sleeve, tired eyes, a noble dog warming your boots, and you're feeling, strangely, like you've made it. Until a servant approaches. He bows. Smiles. Announces that the hound has, in fact, taken your seat. Permanently. Yes. Apparently, if a noble's pet chooses your place, and its noble owner likes the symbolism, your chair may be reassigned. You're politely asked to give the beast some space. Which is polite servant speak for: please stand now or we'll make you stand permanently. You nod, grin, step aside. The dog sighs deeply and stretches out in your still warm spot. You, meanwhile, are escorted to a modest bench at the side, just between the harpist and the coat rack. But it's fine. You can still see the table. You can still hear the jokes, the laughter, the clinking goblets. And let's be honest, at this point in the evening, you're just grateful not to be seated under the table. Because yes, some guests have found themselves demoted all the way down, typically after too many accidental flirtations or a poorly aimed toast. Some of them are now playing dice with the kitchen staff. You lean back. You sip. The monkey is now asleep. The dog is snoring. And you? You're part of it all now. Sort of. The dog has claimed your seat. You've been politely relocated to what could generously be called the overflow bench. But there's an odd comfort in it. You're out of the line of fire. You're near a column, a tapestry, and most importantly, not directly in the splash zone of any more sauces, sneezes, or noble flirtations. You take a deep breath, only to catch a whiff of something oddly metallic. And that's when you remember one of the most unsettling facts about medieval banquets. Someone at the table might still be trying to poison someone else. You think you're joking. You're not. Because behind every glimmering goblet and golden-crusted meat pie, there's a quiet, lingering fear in the royal court: who wants whom dead tonight? Poison paranoia wasn't just a fantasy. It was a serious, documented, disturbingly common part of noble life. especially when the guests included foreign dignitaries, power-hungry cousins, or anyone with a minor inheritance dispute and access to mushrooms. Which is why most royal courts had a role as curious as it was stomach-turning, the taster. He's the man, or, on rare occasion, the woman, whose job it was to try every dish before the important people ate it. If he didn't die in a few minutes, it was considered safe. Not definitely safe, just probably. The taster at this feast is standing quietly to the side, pale but upright, with what looks like gravy on his collar and mild trauma in his eyes. Historians still argue whether tasters were effective or simply symbolic. After all, many poisons took hours to act. Some were slow, some were subtle, some were based on moldy bread or suspicious herbs that only affected the already weak. Still, the taster tasted. And nobility watched. You glance at the taster now. He's sipping from a chalice that had been headed for the king. He swishes it. Swallows. Waits. 3, 2, 1. No collapse. No vomiting. Just a discreet nod. The chalice moves forward. But it's not just tasters who kept watch. Nobles also had tricks. Superstitions. Rituals. Some insisted on drinking only from silver cups, because it was believed that silver would darken if poison was present. Spoiler, it didn't. Others would drop bits of bread into wine to soak out toxins. Some carried amulets, often made of toadstone or bezoars, believed to counteract poison if worn or placed in the drink. And yes, bezoars. Dried, hardened lumps taken from the stomachs of goats or oxen, prized as magical poison absorbers. Nothing says, "I'm rich and afraid of my brother-in-law," like stirring your soup with a goat's intestinal marble. More than once, entire courts have gone into panic because someone refused a toast. It might look like bad manners, but in reality, it was self-defense. A duke in 13th century Austria famously turned down a goblet of wine offered by a rival and instead demanded the man drink first. When the man refused? Instant scandal. 3 weeks of tension. 1 excommunication. 0 deaths, but 5 new drinking protocols. You recall the goblet you shared earlier, the one that went around the table like a cursed chalice. You try not to think about it. Too late now. There's also the tester spoon, a small, separate utensil kept near the steward, meant to be dipped into sauces or stews for a pre-taste before serving. But only in fancier courts. Here, in this ever so slightly chaotic feast, you suspect the system is more shrug and pray than anything else. Then there are the paranoid nobles who simply brought their own food. Yes, that was a thing. They'd arrive at a banquet with a personal servant carrying sealed dishes. Not always because they thought someone would kill them, sometimes just because they didn't trust the cook's hygiene. Understandable, really. But for most people, poison paranoia was something you lived with. You dined anyway. You smiled. You shared figs and duck and fish pies with your enemies. Because not eating? That would raise suspicion. And in court, suspicion gets you noticed, and not in a good way. At this point in the meal, when everyone's guard is low and the wine has softened edges, it's the perfect time for a bold move, if one were to be made. Which is why a few guests are now watching each other more than their food. Quiet glances. Sudden silences. A piece of untouched meat left conspicuously on a trencher. These are small things, but in a court that trades in whispers, they're loud. Of course, most guests will survive. You probably will too. Probably. And yet, there's a strange tension in the room. It's subtle, like a tight string under soft music. The king has stopped eating. Not because he's full, but because he's waiting. He always waits, watching others first. One bite from the wrong person could turn a feast into a funeral. And that's not poetic exaggeration. It's history. A feast in Naples once ended when a bishop dropped dead into his stew. Everyone froze. No one else ate. Turned out it was a stroke, but the court spent 6 hours interrogating the chef, the tasters, and the spoonmaker. True story. So when a noble 3 seats down suddenly stands and excuses himself, leaving half a quail untouched, everyone notices. He smiles. "Too much pie," he says. Everyone nods. No one believes him. Still, you're grateful for one thing: you're not important enough to be poisoned. No one poisons the quiet guest who gave a cherry back politely and didn't flirt too hard with the fig lady. And the dog under the table? Sleeping. Safe. Dogs don't lie. You relax a little. Your cup is still warm. Your trencher is no longer edible. You've learned to sip slowly, chew quietly, and, most importantly, watch who's watching who. Because in a medieval feast, survival isn't just about etiquette. It's about timing, instincts, and trusting the man with the goat stone. You survived the royal sneeze. Dodged poison. Even made peace with the fact that a dog usurped your seat. So naturally, you begin to think the worst is behind you. But then someone claps twice, a lute strikes a bold chord, and a voice rings out. And now, for the entertainment. You blink. Wasn't the monkey riding a dog the entertainment? Apparently not. Because in many royal courts, the dinner was just the warm-up. The main show, the true climax of the feast, came mid-meal or just after, when nobles were full of wine and just tipsy enough to pretend mime is an acceptable art form. Yes. Mimes. But we'll get to them. First up, you're treated to a bardic interlude. A man in a pointed hat begins reciting a tragic poem about a goose who fell in love with a knight. It's unclear whether this is an allegory or someone's actual family drama, but the audience listens politely, even as a few side conversations resume quietly under the table. You've entered the performance phase of the feast. Here's how it usually works. As the final meat courses wind down and the sweetness of dessert dulls the senses, the host signals for divertissements, a series of musical, theatrical, or acrobatic acts meant to impress, distract, or, occasionally, punish guests with bad taste. A juggler appears next. He's balancing apples, knives, and, wait, is that your trencher bread? Could be. He tosses them into the air while humming a tune about St. George and a very confused dragon. The nobles clap. The monkey yawns. Historically, entertainment at royal banquets was elaborate and often bizarre. In the court of Burgundy, they once staged a crusader play, in which 6 nobles in full armor rode ponies through the banquet hall. In England, performers dressed as trees recited verses about forest law. In Milan, they once released live birds from a pie. The pie bird incident? Real. The birds? Terrified. The guests? Thrilled. The cleanup? Unforgettable. You're beginning to understand that there's no such thing as too weird for court entertainment. Next up is the mime. He wears white makeup, exaggerated frowns, and performs a silent sketch about a baker who loses his bread and finds redemption in a cabbage. No one understands it. But everyone claps anyway. You smile. Awkwardly. The mime makes eye contact with you. Holds it. Too long. You look away. The music swells again. A troupe of dancers enters, probably local villagers with ribbon sleeves and the hopeful desperation of people trying to make enough coin to not have to churn butter tomorrow. They spin, leap, and pretend not to notice when a noble tosses a goblet just a little too close to their feet. Meanwhile, 2 jugglers begin a contest to see who can balance more roasted quail on their heads. One wins. The other sulks. A monk performs next. Yes, a monk. He plays the hurdy-gurdy and sings about abstinence in a voice that suggests he's had many conflicting feelings about it. The crowd titters. The queen fans herself. The steward yawns very, very discreetly. Now, you might wonder, why all this effort? Because medieval feasts weren't just social, they were spectacles. A chance for the host to prove their wealth, sophistication, and ability to tame chaos. A noble who could feed 200 people and keep them entertained for 4 hours without injury or duels. That was power. Plus, entertainment helped mask the tension. When half the room might be quietly plotting to overthrow the other half, nothing diffuses potential mutiny like a man dressed as a badger telling riddles in falsetto. And make no mistake, you're expected to react. If a performer looks your way, you smile. If they offer a prop, you accept. If they throw a pie in the air, you duck. Not reacting is seen as rude. Overreacting? That's dangerous. Remember the countess who laughed too hard at a poorly executed sword dance and was later accused of sorcery? Yes. That happened. A fire breather enters now. This is your cue to subtly shift your cup away from the aisle. He inhales deeply, roars a gout of flame toward the ceiling, and everyone claps. You notice 3 guests near the back edge their chairs away, possibly survivors of past feasts gone too flammable. The next act is an awkward ballad sung by 2 squires who are clearly being punished for something. One is off-key, the other seems unsure whether he's meant to harmonize or confess. You feel for them. By this point, the nobles are less focused. More wine. More gossip. Someone's dozing. Someone else is trying to start a dice game beneath the table with a bored minstrel. A dog is snoring. You're wondering if the mime is still staring at you. He is. But then, at last, a hush falls over the hall. The king stands. All entertainment stops. Everyone watches. He lifts a goblet. Everyone follows. He toasts the feast, the guests, the saints, the year's harvest, his lineage, the pie with the bird, and possibly a local sheep whose name you can't catch. You raise your own cup. Sip carefully. Try not to blink too loudly. It's the final performance of the evening, the royal toast. Once it's complete, the performances are truly over. The lute player shifts to lullabies. The dancers bow out. The mime disappears, still without blinking. And slowly, surely, the nobles begin to prepare for the next act, not on stage, but in the halls. The exit. But that's a lesson for the next section. For now, you survived the meat juggling, mime flirting, and fire-breathing bard without injury or embarrassment. And honestly, that's a standing ovation in itself. The fire-breather has safely retreated. The mime is gone, mercifully. The dog remains in your chair, still snoring. And now, as the echoes of the royal toast fade into the vaulted ceiling, a collective hush settles over the feast. Not the kind that demands silence, but the kind that signals the game is nearly over. It's time to leave the table. Which, as you're now discovering, is not nearly as simple as standing up and stretching your legs. No. Not at a medieval royal banquet. Here, how you leave the table can say more about you than how you arrived. This is the final etiquette gauntlet. One last opportunity to make a good impression, or a terrible, unforgettable one. First, you watch. No one stands until the king or queen gives a cue. It might be a subtle gesture, a hand placed on the goblet, a nod to the steward, or in some courts, simply the act of rising from their seat. In others, like the rigidly ceremonial courts of Castile or the Habsburgs, an actual bell might be rung, followed by a long silence, and only then the signal to rise. Historians still debate whether these departure signals were codified or left deliberately vague to keep guests nervous. Either way, you don't stand until royalty does. Ever. Doing so might imply impatience. Or worse, an assumption that the feast is over without permission. A knight once made that mistake in Philip the Bold's court. He stood, bowed, and made a move toward the exit before the Duke had finished his final bite of pear. He was later invited to spend a week in a nearby monastery to reflect on his timing. In silence. With soup. So you wait. Finally, the Queen rises. She dabs her lips with linen, gives a gentle nod to the musicians, and begins to walk. The King follows. And now, the room begins its ritual shuffle. There's no stampede. No pushing. Just a carefully rehearsed cascade of exits, starting from the top of the table and working its way down the ranks. It's like nobles are assigned invisible strings, tugged one by one toward the door by a higher power, an elegant, silent conga line of digestion and formality. You're seated, or rather, bench-perched, low enough in the hierarchy that your turn won't come for a while. But you don't mind. It gives you time to observe. And what a performance it is. Some guests exit like saints, heads high, smiles soft, napkins folded with geometric perfection. Others treat it like a final flourish, waving, complimenting the stew, laughing just loud enough to be noticed but not mocked. But occasionally, someone gets it wrong. Like the man who forgets to bow before leaving the table. There's a cough. A quiet gasp. A steward steps forward, not to punish, but to guide. The man quickly turns, bows awkwardly, then leaves. Damage done. Someone will whisper about it. Maybe not tonight. But tomorrow? Absolutely. Then there's the opposite, the excessive lever. You've seen two already, nobles who bow 6 times, kiss the steward's hand, compliment every course, and pretend they didn't just chew goose with their mouths open. It's too much. Everyone sees through it. Even the dog looks unimpressed. When it's finally your turn, you stand slowly. Smooth your tunic. Bow, not too deep, not too fast. Just enough to say, I understand I was here by grace, not guarantee. Then you step away from the table with the same careful reverence as someone walking on a frozen lake. No sudden movements. No dropped goblets. But you're not done yet. Because once you leave the table, you must pass the high table. Yes. That long, decorated stretch where the king, queen, and favored nobles remain seated just a little longer. Some courts required all exiting guests to pass before them and offer thanks, often a short bow or a murmured compliment on the feast. It wasn't just manners, it was loyalty theater. You approach. The king nods. You bow. The queen pretends not to notice, which is the highest compliment she's offered anyone all night. You don't trip. You don't speak. You just exit, with grace. Well, almost. A page boy darts in front of you carrying a plate of leftover pastries. You sidestep. Slightly too fast. Your sleeve brushes a tapestry. No one notices. Except a jester, who winks. You nod, as if this were a planned gesture. He winks again. You walk faster. Outside the feast hall, the air is cooler. Quieter. More real. Servants bustle past with trays and cloths. Dogs sniff for scraps. A lute plays faintly in a nearby chamber. And nobles begin to reassemble themselves, gathering cloaks, retelling favorite jokes from the night, speculating about the mime's obsession with staring contests. But the feast is not quite over. Because now comes the post-dinner drift, that in-between moment when the meal is done, but the politics continue. Where alliances are forged in the corridor. Deals are whispered beside torch sconces. And those too drunk to walk straight are escorted, discreetly, by squires pretending not to laugh. One noble loudly offers a toast to the courage of the pudding. Another is quietly arguing about who was seated closer to the marzipan display. A lady adjusts her necklace while scanning the crowd for someone. You don't ask who. You spot the woman who gave you the figure. She sees you. Smiles. then vanishes into the velvet crowd. You exhale. You did it. You've eaten, smiled, bowed, chewed, flirted, dodged mime energy, endured questionable stew, and outlasted a dog for a seat you never got back. You've learned what all this pomp and performance is really about. It's not about food. It's about surviving status, with style. You're outside the feast hall now, but the performance of the evening isn't over, it's just changed stages. Because once the last goblet is drained and the final tart has been nervously poked, the nobility doesn't just go home and brush their teeth with a bundle of mint. Oh no. Welcome to the after-feast games, a twilight tradition that somehow manages to be both exhilarating and deeply, deeply awkward. First come the corridor conversations. This is where nobles lean into shadowed corners, speaking in hushed tones about inheritance, marriage, or whether the cheese course was intentionally omitted. These whispered chats are part gossip, part strategy. In many ways, they're more dangerous than the feast itself, because the only things sharper than the knives used at dinner are the tongues wagging in the hallway. You keep your head down, pretending to admire a wall tapestry that appears to depict a bear playing a harp. You're not in the mood to get drawn into a debate about land taxes or who sat too close to the Duchess of Vinegarshire. But you can't help overhearing fragments. And I told her, if she passes the boar without toasting the count again, she can forget the dowry. But was it really venison, or just brave pork? He was seated next to a monk on purpose, I'm telling you. You sidestep politely and slip into the next chamber, where the real fun begins. The torchlight flickers over polished stone floors. The air smells of spiced wine, candle wax, and mild perspiration. Nobles mingle in a strange post-feast fog. This is where everything gets looser. There's a kind of sacred chaos in the air. Lords who were silent during dinner now speak too loudly. Ladies who held their goblets daintily are double-fisting mead and debating theology with knights slouched in window seats. A few guests begin to dance, poorly. There's no music. Just humming and swaying and the occasional attempt at a lute riff from someone who shouldn't have touched a lute. You try to blend in, smile when smiled at, nod when nods are needed, and avoid eye contact with anyone holding dice or looking particularly bored. Because that's when the pranks start. Yes. Medieval nobles, filled with honeyed wine and bored out of their titles, invented pranks that straddled the line between silly and utterly unhinged. Take, for example, the noble who swapped a knight's wine with fish brine during an after-feast in Aquitaine. Or the infamous roasted apple filled with mustard surprise, which sent 3 courtiers to the baths early. Or the time in Aragon when someone released a goat into the upper gallery and watched as it chose, unprompted, to sit on the duke's lap. Tonight seems calm at first. Until a jester throws a cloak over a nobleman mid-sentence, spins him twice, and shouts, "Now you're the abbess," to general laughter and a slow clap from a monk who may or may not be in on the joke. Historians believe these games served as social release valves, an opportunity for the rigid caste system to momentarily soften. For 1 hour, the lord might be the fool, and the page might tell a joke that makes a countess giggle. It didn't last. But it mattered. In one corner, a group of young squires are mock-jousting with table legs. A lady sings a bawdy song about a baker and a bishop that ends with a pun so filthy, even the candle flames look embarrassed. You stand near a hearth, watching it all unfold. A baron staggers past you, raising his cup and declaring, "To the toast that almost took my tooth." He's cheered on by 3 others who clearly didn't eat the toast at all. Then come the games of challenge, early precursors to dares. Drink a goblet of mixed sauces. Balance a trencher on your head. Recite a Latin proverb backward. One man is blindfolded and spun, then told to walk a straight line. He almost ends up in the fireplace. Everyone cheers. You're offered a goblet filled with what smells like cider, honey, and maybe fish. You shake your head politely. The goblet is passed to the juggler, who drinks it in one gulp and immediately turns purple. Everyone applauds. It's hard not to be charmed. This part of the feast, the unbuttoned chaos, feels more honest than anything that happened over the table. Here, the nobles let go. The stakes are lower. The smiles feel less rehearsed. But make no mistake, you're still being watched. That steward over by the wine barrel? He's taking mental notes. The lady who gave you the fig earlier? She's in the corner, laughing at a joke, but glancing your way every few minutes. And the dog that stole your seat? Somehow it's in here too, lying by the fire, looking smug. As the hour wears on, people begin to drift away, either toward chambers, courtyards, or further mischief. One noble proposes a midnight torchlit footrace around the manor. Another begins to sketch caricatures of guests using coal on the wall. The queen's cousin is snoring in a windowsill with his hat over his face. You begin to feel the weight of the evening, the heaviness of too much meat, too many rules, and just enough excitement to leave you exhilarated and exhausted. And still, through it all, the etiquette lingers. You offer one last bow to a passing knight. Smile at a servant clearing spilled berries. Pick up your discarded goblet and set it gently back on the tray. You've made it this far. One final gauntlet remains. Tomorrow morning, they'll talk about tonight. About who stood when, who burped too loud, who laughed too long, who shared a fig, who sneezed in the presence of royalty and lived to tell the tale. The feast is over. But the memory is just beginning. It's deep night now. The torches sputter in iron sconces. Servants shuffle through half-empty halls with trays of forgotten goblets and broken trenchers. The guests have either retired, passed out, or are off somewhere attempting to flirt by reciting bad Latin. You linger in the corridor for a moment longer, listening to the echo of distant laughter, the soft jangle of a minstrel's fading tune, and your own heart finally returning to a steady, non-panicked rhythm. Congratulations! You survived. But don't get too comfortable, because while the feast may be over, the aftermath is only beginning. Now is when the real judgments are made. In the morning, stewards and scribes will gather. And though no one will say it aloud, they'll compare notes: who arrived first, who sat too close, who chewed like a goat, who didn't laugh at the Lord's joke about the sturgeon. There won't be punishments, usually, but reputations will shift, alliances bend, and invitations may or may not appear next time a goose is roasted. You begin to walk slowly through the quiet halls, past velvet drapes and extinguished candle stubs. On a side bench, a pair of noblemen argue sleepily about whether the dessert had quince or turnip. It was probably both. A servant wraps a snoring squire in a tapestry. Someone hums an off-key version of the Toasted Knight's Lament. And you think, what was all of that? It was a meal. It was a ceremony. It was a test. It was a theater of survival wrapped in roast fowl and flickering torchlight. From the first terrifying moment of not knowing which seat to take, to the final bow toward the monarch before leaving the hall, every second was choreography. But unlike a dance, the steps kept changing depending on who coughed, who kissed a fig, and whether or not a monkey rode through juggling pears. Let's review what you've conquered. You learned how not to spill wine, even when sharing goblets with people who may or may not have bathed this month. You figured out how to eat soup without a spoon, meat without a fork, and dessert without accidentally proposing to someone. You avoided mimicking the mime. You politely ignored the fire breather who nearly scorched the stew. You resisted the urge to yell, "Why is the dog in my seat?" And most importantly, you played the part. Because at a medieval royal feast, everyone's performing. Some are warriors, some are poets, some are schemers, but all are actors in a grand production of power, pageantry, and poultry. You hear footsteps behind you. It's the steward, the same one who gave you side-eye when your trencher sagged in soup. He nods at you now. Just once. Brief. Subtle. But in courtly language, that's a standing ovation. You nod back. Continue walking. Eventually, you reach the guest wing. A small cot, a basin of cloudy water, a stiff wool blanket that smells like rosemary and ambition. You sit. You breathe. Somewhere down the corridor, the last toast echoes. Someone toasts the pudding again. Someone else is sick in a stairwell. You lie back. And you realize something else. The feast never really ends. Not here. It moves from the table to the corridor, from the corridor to the chamber, from one whispered alliance to another clumsy flirtation. It simmers in the memory of who was kind, who was cruel, who tripped, who toasted, and who said nothing, but still managed to be noticed. And in a few months, when the next feast is announced, the scrolls will go out. The candles will be lit again. The monkey may return. And you? You might get a better seat this time. Or at least one the dog doesn't claim. Well played, dear guest. You made it out without scandal, bloodshed, or being mistaken for a kitchen boy. Not bad for your first time. So now, the torches fade. The tables are empty. The lords and ladies have all gone to sleep, or to plot. And you? You're safe. You made it. The clatter of plates is gone now, replaced by the soft hush of night wind through the stone corridors. The candles are nothing more than wax puddles. The dogs are curled by the hearth. Even the mime has disappeared into some dark velvet curtain, hopefully never to return. There's no more wine to sip. No more trenchers to dodge. No more stewards watching your every move with a quill in one hand and a list of social offenses in the other. Just quiet now. Let your breath slow. Let the velvet dark of the chamber wrap around you. You've navigated every awkward custom, every eyebrow-raising bite, every dangerous glance. You've smiled when you needed to. Chewed softly when it mattered. Survived. Maybe next time, you'll know how to spot the poisoned goose before it's carved. Maybe you'll get the first seat above the salt. Maybe you'll share dessert without fearing for your inheritance. But for now, just rest. The feast is over. The court has fallen quiet. And the only thing left is the soft rhythm of your breath, the gentle hum of sleep approaching, and the memory of flickering torchlight dancing over platters of gold and gravy. Close your eyes. Let your thoughts soften. Let the feast fade. The awkwardness, the laughter, the glory of it all, set it down. You are far from the table now. And sleep is the most polite guest of all. Sweet dreams.